Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session. We have Chris Neumann with us today, founder and CEO of Commonwealth Ventures. Welcome, Chris. Very happy to have you.
Thank you
I'm
very
going to
much.
leave the stage for you now.
All right. How long should we wait for people to join, or do we need to wait for people to join?
No, people should be there already.
All right. Perfect. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Happy Diwali for those of you celebrating that today. I'm excited to be here and join you. I very much wish I could be there in person, either in Amsterdam or Cairo. So hopefully this time next year, we'll be able to meet together. Before I get started, this session is intended to be very interactive. So I encourage you to submit questions either I believe there's a chat functionality or a QA functionality, so I've got that set up. So as I'm going along, please ask questions, and I'm here to provide some insights into what's going on in Silicon Valley and in the US. So as a quick introduction, a little bit of background on myself. I am a former founder. I've been involved in a number of startups as an early employee and as the founder. I've also been a venture capitalist and investor. I used to be with a firm called 500 Startups, where I ran their data accelerator in San Francisco. And now I run an organization called Commonwealth Ventures. And Commonwealth Ventures, our mission is to help founders and ecosystems outside of the US better understand and connect with Silicon Valley so that they can learn from the expertise here in the US and in the Bay Area in particular, and understand how to engage with it, how to potentially raise capital with it, and make decisions about global changes in their business. Before I go further, or I guess as a way to start off the session, I find it helpful to talk a little bit about how I see the Bay Area and its place in the global startup ecosystem. Something that folks commonly say is that entrepreneurialism or innovation is not specific to a region, right? We see amazing founders all over the world. The Bay Area, though, does have some advantages that are long held. It's the region where technical innovation, as we know it today, is most mature, right? In the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, we've had startups and VCs and this whole ecosystem, coming on 70, 80 years now, whereas many ecosystems around the world are still in their infancy. So what does it take to create a startup ecosystem like that, aside from a lot of time? There are three things that really make the Bay Area and Silicon Valley what it is and such a special place. First and foremost, it really is the only startup community in the world that draws people from all over the planet. Right? When folks are talking about where they want to go to raise capital, where they might consider moving their business, where they have ambitions to spend time from either an educational or a networking or a business growth perspective, it is typically San Francisco, Silicon Valley. So what we see here is we see founders from all walks of life coming to this area. We see investors, we see various folks who want to be here. Secondly, is the level of expertise. Because of that density of people, because we have so many founders having come here and so many people having had experience working at high growth startups, it is by far the place in the world that has the most individuals at every possible job position and level of a company who've seen what it's like to be inside a fast growth company. In most other ecosystems, although we see amazing early stage ecosystems, right? When you actually talk about most cities, the number of people who've seen the inside of a company that went from 0 to $1 billion in 5 or 10 years are few and far between. And it's going to take many generations for other ecosystems to get that level of density. And finally, key to the Bay Area and key to the Valley's ongoing success is a notion of paying it forward, of helping each other out. Brad Feld, who many of you may know as a very well-known blogger and investor and author, wrote that startup communities thrive in environments where information, talent, and capital flow freely. One of the things that has made the Bay Area such a unique ecosystem is that sharing of knowledge and that sharing of information. The idea that people inside different companies will interact with each other frequently. They'll share their ideas. They'll do favors for other people that they don't necessarily have a reason to. There's a long-term understanding of engagement in the Bay Area that creates an environment where people really are motivated and genuinely want to help others. We talk about knowledge spillover caused by that density, right? Simply physically being around so many incredible startups, you learn from each other in ways that aren't necessarily intentional, right? Serendipity is a big thing that comes from physical proximity, where in other places where there are fewer startups or they're geographically distributed, you have to make more of an effort for that to happen. And so I'll stop there. And before I start getting into ways that we can really tap into that, I know a number of people have just joined in, so I'll repeat something I said at the beginning. This is intended to be a very interactive session. So as I'm going along, please throw questions into the Q&A or into the chat. I'm going to talk about some tips and tricks for engaging with the Bay Area for probably about 5 or 10 minutes. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up to whatever questions you have. So I'm here to answer your questions about the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, and the US tech ecosystem. So I just made a comment that people in the Bay Area like to pay it forward, right? The Bay Area, I think one thing that makes it a little bit different is that virtually everyone who has a level of status in the Bay Area has built something. Right now, some people came from more privileged backgrounds than others, to be sure, but the status that is achieved through going and creating a startup or building a company or being part of that grind has created a culture where the vast majority of people along the way had to tap into their social capital being favors, right? In my own experience, when I was starting as an entrepreneur, there were people who had no reason to help me out, who answered questions, gave me mentorship and advice, made introductions for me. And so that infused in me a willingness and a desire to do the same. And that's something that's very prevalent throughout the Silicon Valley. Now, the other important thing to understand is that the most precious commodity here to most people is time. For those of you who visited the Bay Area, there's a certain intensity, there's a certain high pressure environment where almost everyone has more things that they want to do than they have time to. And so when you put those things together, people are willing to help you, but you have to make it easy for them. And that's something that's a little bit different than in most other startup ecosystems. In other places, it's common to reach out to somebody and say, hey, could I get a half hour of your time? I'd like to pick your brain. I'd like to get some advice. I'd really like to just speak to you for a half an hour. In the Bay Area, that's not usually, unless you have a very strong connection to a person, going to get you a positive response. Instead, you have to be very specific in advance. And this is something that culturally is different from many other places. When reaching out to somebody and saying, hey, can I have a half an hour of your time? You need to explain what you want to get out of that time so they can make a judgment as to whether or not they can help you. So instead of, hey, I'd like to get a half an hour of your time to talk about my startup idea, it's, hi, Chris, I know that you have been involved in 3 big data startups. I'm creating a big data startup. Here are 3 problems that I'm facing. I'd like to know if these are problems that you could offer advice on, right? So something very, very specific where I could look at that and say, wow, okay, this is something I understand, and I can spend time with them. Or I could respond and say, well, no, I don't have time to do that. So why am I telling you all this? Well, we're now in a place, as everyone well knows, that due to global circumstances, the world is both less connected and more connected. On the one hand, I can't physically be with you at the summit today. On the other hand, I'm dialing in from halfway around the world, as many of you are. What's happened is that the pay it forward culture in the Bay Area and in the US in general has become more connected via things like Twitter and email and newsletters and Substack and the like. And so what we're seeing now is entrepreneurs from all over the world reaching out to people in the US and making contact, right? If there are people that you look at, that you've followed their blogs, that you've followed them on Twitter, you've read their work, you're really interested in their startups, there's no reason for you to not reach out to them if there's something you want help. And I would encourage you all to not necessarily look at borders today as being in the way of you making contact or getting advice from people all over the world. If you make it easy for people, if you want to reach out to a founder or an investor or an advisor or a mentor or an author or whoever the case may be, you're now in a position where that can happen. And in many cases, that person will reach back and help out. Today, we are seeing funding happen where the investors have never met the person in person. We're seeing VC funds, right? VCs raise money themselves, and we're seeing those close with the VCs having never met their investors. We're seeing companies be founded with employees all over the world. We're seeing problems being solved. We're seeing customer engagement where an in-person sale didn't happen. And so that's something that I would definitely encourage you all to do. One piece of information that I will add to that, though, is there are a couple of cultural etiquette things that are a little bit different about Silicon Valley in general relative to the rest of the world. One of those key things is something called double opt-in. If you haven't heard of double opt-in, I would encourage you to Google it. The term has been around for probably about 10 years now. It was originally coined by Fred Wilson, and it's a very simple concept. The idea with a double opt-in is before you introduce two people, make sure they both want to be introduced, right? And it sounds kind of silly, sounds very obvious, but in other cultures, in other physical places, it's not common that you would go meet somebody for coffee or whatever the case may be. And he or she would say, wow, this is a great meeting. You really need to meet this other person, and then immediately make that introduction. So, I might meet somebody and she would say to me, wow, Chris, you need to meet Mohammed. Let me connect the two of you and make that introduction. And that would be completely fine. If you were to do that in the Bay Area, you actually lose social capital because of this notion of respect for people's time. And so when looking for introductions or making introductions, it's very important that the other person be consulted, right? So in the Bay Area, that conversation would be something more along the lines of, wow, you should really meet Mohammed. Can you send me a quick email with an overview of the company, and I'll check with him if that's okay, right? And there's a little more work that's pushed on to you as the person being introduced. I would encourage you all to Google someone named Arjun Dev Arora, ARJUN space DEV space ARORA. He has a Medium page with some excellent writing on etiquette pieces around Silicon Valley culture, how to do introductions, how to request introductions, and how to be more effective navigating some of the unique cultural aspects of the Bay Area. And last but not least, and this is a little bit of a fun tip, but an important one, when you are engaging with people from the Bay Area, if you're talking to somebody who is in San Francisco or Palo Alto or the relevant regions, please, 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 please do not ever call San Francisco Frisco or San Fran. The simple reason why, nobody there does that. And why does that matter? Well, there's a really weird dichotomy, or paradox is maybe the better word, that's happening now. On the one hand, people are connecting with individuals from all over the world. So we're seeing investors and founders in the Bay Area connect with people in every country imaginable. But as soon as that connection's made, you forget that you're not just down the street. And in the Bay Area, because of the level of sophistication of startups and ecosystems, and aspects of the ecosystem. There's a certain influence that comes from imagining that a person has the same experience of having been here. And when you say certain terminology that makes it obvious that you are not in the Bay Area, that you're not familiar with it, you lose a little bit of that magic, insofar as they're reminded that you are a founder in another country, right? The way you look won't do that. The accent you have will not do that. In the Bay Area, there are people from every walk of life, every country imaginable. And so it's normal to engage with founders who are immigrants, who are others. I myself am not American, I'm an immigrant here. But when you have those conversations, you presume a similar level of, how do I say it? Experience, right? It's like when you go to a university and you assume that everyone has taken the same classes. So yes, there's a comment here. When I visited SF, nobody had any clue that the rest of the world calls it Frisco. Exactly, right? So in the Bay Area, we call it San Francisco, SF, the city, but there's these names that people outside of the US refer to it as. And when you hear that, it immediately tells you, oh, this person isn't from here. And that's significant, not in terms of the country, but in terms of they don't necessarily know all of the things that we've learned here. They're not familiar with the cultures. They may not have as much experience in some of the startup terminology or techniques that are here. Let's see, what is the best way to connect with people from Silicon Valley when you don't really have a connection there? Well, very specifically, you have to figure out an individual to connect with, right? So it's not so much, hey, I want to meet people in Silicon Valley, right? What is the reason for wanting to do that? Do you want advice on a specific thing? Do you want to open a market? Do you want to understand growth hacking techniques or something about a particular business model? And then you need to figure out who is the actual individual that you want to meet. And then you need to do research on them. And then you need to send them an email, a Twitter, whatever kind of message, and reach out and say, hey, this is the very specific reason why I want to talk to you, right? And that goes back to what I said earlier, which is you have to make it easy, but you also have to be really specific, right? I can't emphasize enough that everyone in the Bay Area has more demands on their time than they possibly have time to answer, particularly people who have well-established public personas. People are constantly asking them for advice. They're constantly asking them for help. And most of them really genuinely do want to help, but they can only help a certain number of people with a certain amount of time, right? So if you are, as I said, I use myself as an example, right? A data-related founder, right? Okay, I want to meet very specifically people who have founded similar companies to me, who have faced a very similar problem, and then you write an email or you get an introduction or you send a Twitter message with that to that extent. Another way that is really effective at connecting in with the Silicon Valley is expat networks. So I mentioned earlier, I'm an immigrant. I'm originally from Canada. When people reach out to me, when they email me and they say, hey, I'm a Canadian founder, I'm trying to get connected with Silicon Valley for this purpose, can you help? I am more likely to help because I have that shared background. So to the extent that you can find expats from your country, your region, your city, that can be incredibly effective. Techwadi is a fantastic organization that I know is involved in this event that does a lot to connect the Middle East into Silicon Valley. Last thing I'm going to just touch on briefly and then open up for more questions is the notion of fundraising. And I think this is an incredibly important thing. Many founders, they read things like TechCrunch, they see all the funding announcements about the Bay Area, and they say, wow, if I could just get connected there, it'll be easier to raise money, right? I'm struggling to raise money for my startup in whatever city I'm in or whatever country I'm in, or the investors aren't getting it, or the investors are too conservative. If I could only get to Silicon Valley investors, that would fix my problem. That's not the way it works. And I think it's really important to say that to everyone, because it helps to dismiss a few misconceptions. If you are a founder of a company that is in Cairo or wherever, there's a couple of reasons why you will not, at least at the early stage, and let's call that, pre-seed to seed stage, you will likely not be able to get American investment. Number one is, by and large, the majority of American VCs can only invest in American companies. I won't go into all of the reasons why, but it effectively boils down to, when a VC raises a fund, they have a very specific thesis, and that thesis typically has a geographical bound to it. So they say, we're going to invest in companies with this type of a profile based in the US. Secondly, if you're at an early stage, right, pre-seed or seed, the majority of investors genuinely want to help, and that is more effective in person. If they are not familiar with the market you're going after, if your first market is Egypt, and I'm an investor in San Francisco, I don't know anything about the Egyptian market. So I can't necessarily help you with that. I can't give you advice. And so if I believe that I'm reasonably helpful as an investor, I can't apply that part of my persona, that part of my value add to your company. And third, in general, Americans tend to look at omission as a negative thing. So whether it's fair or not, if you try to raise money in the US and you haven't raised money in your home country, the question an investor will immediately ask, whether fair or not, is, what's wrong with this company? Why wouldn't local investors invest in it? I presume that the local investor knows more than I do, therefore there must be something wrong. And so when it comes to investing, by and large, what we see raising local to your country or region first. Then as you expand your market regionally, you can go outside of that, right? So you can raise in the region, then maybe you can go up to Europe. At the point at which you are entering or in the US market, that's the point where an American investor who doesn't have a specific thesis about your country will tend to lean in. The flip side is, that's also why we see many American-based investors having funds that are local to different regions, so they can have regional investor there. And so that's the last point I wanted to make there. I think we've got about 5 minutes left. So I'll open it up for other questions if anyone wants to ask anything about San Francisco, the Bay Area, or the United States more broadly. And please don't be shy. So you're telling me there's 50 people on this and nobody has any questions? Okay, there we go. Let's see. How important is it to have an AI element in your startup? AI is a buzzword, which means absolutely nothing. If anything, it's the opposite. So if you today in the US come with a deck that has the word AI all over it, we'll look at it and assume it's complete nonsense. American investors, by virtue of being much more sophisticated, want to know what you're actually doing to solve your problem, right? And so if you're coming in and we've got a website and we've got some machine learning and here's how we use it, great. But just putting AI for the sake of AI is in fact going to have a negative element, as is any other buzzword that exists. So one thing I think that's probably helpful to understand about American investors is that by virtue of American investors seeing companies from all over the world, by the time an American investor sees your startup, they have probably already seen 10 startups doing a similar thing, right? So there's no such thing as a unique startup here in the Bay Area. There may be the first startup, but any business around, whether it's food delivery or e-commerce or whatever the case may be, we see them in themes, right? And so we're looking for the ones that have the best insights about the market and are building the appropriate product to serve that market, rather than the ones that fill in the latest and greatest buzzwords. And same goes true for machine learning, same goes through for data analytics, right? Tools are to be used in building a solution. And if a particular solution does not need a tool, then there's no reason to have that tool. Let's see. Globally, where else do you see a potential Silicon Valley appearing? There will never be a Silicon Valley anywhere else in the world. I think that is incredibly important to recognize, right? Silicon Valley is a globally unique place, and that's okay. So the goal should not be to be the next Silicon Valley or a new Silicon Valley, right? If you think about it just from a funding perspective, investors in the US have the most sophistication. Founders around the world, when they look to where would they like to go in their dream scenario, it's the US. That's not suddenly going to change. However, there's an incredible number of cities that are bubbling up to really create their own very powerful and impactful ecosystems. Some of the cities that are having a lot of impact right now in sort of no particular order, Toronto in Canada, London in the UK, Berlin in Germany, Singapore. There's obviously an incredible amount of stuff going on in China now. That's a little bit unique in that there's a massive domestic market there. So we tend to think of that a little differently from other places. But there's incredible. New York obviously is a very strong ecosystem. There's a lot going on in Eastern Europe right now at the sort of larger scale. But then at the smaller scale, there's cities and countries all over the world that are carving out their niches, right? We're seeing whether it's activity going on in the Middle East and in places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi. If we go further south, Nigeria, the amount of stuff happening there is incredible. Indonesia is another fast growing market that's creating all sorts of incredible companies to solve problems that are unique there. So I think it's less important to ask the question, what is the next Silicon Valley, and more, what is the unique manifestation of the startup ecosystem that is possible here? Very good question. I think we have time for one more, I believe, if there's any other questions from the group. All right, well, thank you very much. If any of you want to connect with me, you can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is CK Neumann, Neumann. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference and have a wonderful Saturday.
Thank you so much, Chris. Very insightful session.
Thank you, Yasmin.
Have a great day.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.